sold to the enemy tribe, saved by his heart. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Copper Creek, painting the weathered wooden buildings in shades of gold and amber. Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell stood at her bedroom window, watching the town slowly come to life below. Shopkeepers swept their porches, children chased each other between the buildings, and horses clip-clopped along the dirt road, their riders heading out for another day's work on the surrounding ranches. It was a scene she had witnessed countless times before, but today it felt different. Today she knew it might be the last time she would see it from this window, from this room that had been her sanctuary for 19 years. The sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs made her heart sink. Her father, Thomas Mitchell, was coming to deliver the news she had been dreading for weeks, ever since the night he had stumbled home from the saloon with blood on his knuckles and fear in his eyes. She had known that his gambling debts had finally caught up with them both. "Sarah," he said quietly from the doorway, his voice heavy with shame, "we need to talk." She turned to face him, seeing how the past months had aged him. His once proud shoulders now slumped with the weight of his failures, and his eyes couldn't quite meet hers. Thomas Mitchell had been a good father once, before the cards and the whiskey had taken hold of him, but those days felt like a lifetime ago. "I know, Papa," she said softly. "Harrison Blackwood came to collect, didn't he?" Her father's face crumpled. Harrison Blackwood was the wealthiest and most ruthless man in 3 counties, a cattle baron who had built his empire on the misfortunes of others. Thomas had borrowed heavily from him to cover previous gambling losses, using their small ranch as collateral. When that wasn't enough to cover his debts, he had made one final, desperate wager. "I thought I could win it all back," Thomas whispered. "One good hand, and we would have been free of him forever. But the cards, they just weren't with me, Sarah. They haven't been with me for a long time." Sarah closed her eyes, remembering the conversation she had overheard between her father and Blackwood's men just 2 days earlier. In his desperation, Thomas had wagered the only thing he had left of value, his daughter. The terms were simple and cruel. Sarah would be handed over to Blackwood to settle the debt, and he could do with her as he pleased. But Blackwood's intentions went far beyond simply claiming a young woman as property. He had bigger plans, darker schemes that would use Sarah as a pawn in a larger game of greed and violence. "What does he want me for, Papa?" she asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. Thomas sat heavily on her bed, his head in his hands. "He's going to send you to the Lakota camp beyond Willow Creek. Claims it's a peace offering, but ... He looked up at her with haunted eyes. "Sarah, he wants them to hurt you. He wants an excuse to call in the cavalry and drive them off their land so he can claim it for his cattle." The full horror of the plan settled over her like a cold blanket. Blackwood would send her to the Lakota people as a supposed gesture of goodwill, but he would spread rumors that she was being held against her will. Any harm that came to her, real or imagined, would give him the justification he needed to launch an attack on the tribe and seize their territory. "How long do I have?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "His men will come for you at dawn tomorrow." That night, Sarah packed her few precious belongings into a small leather satchel, a locket with her mother's picture, a worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets, and the blue dress her mother had sewn for her 16th birthday. As she folded the dress carefully, she wondered if she would ever have occasion to wear it again. Sleep came in fragments, filled with dreams of unknown faces and uncertain futures. By the time the sun began to rise over the eastern hills, she was already dressed and waiting by the front door. Blackwood's men arrived precisely at dawn. 3 rough-looking ranch hands led by his foreman, a cruel man named Jake Morrison. They barely spoke to her as they helped her into the back of a dusty wagon, treating her more like cargo than a human being. The journey to the Lakota camp took most of the morning. As they traveled further from town, the landscape changed from settled farmland to rolling hills and open prairie. Sarah had never been this far from Copper Creek before, and despite her fear, she found herself captivated by the wild beauty of the land. When they finally reached the edge of the Lakota territory, Morrison and his men stopped the wagon and gestured for her to get out. "This is as far as we go," Morrison said gruffly. "You walk from here, follow that creek for about a mile, and you'll find their camp. They'll see you coming long before you see them." As the wagon disappeared back toward town, Sarah stood alone on the vast prairie with nothing but the clothes on her back and the small satchel in her hands. The wind whispered through the grass, and somewhere in the distance, an eagle cried out as it circled overhead. She began walking along the creek, her heart pounding with each step. Everything she had heard about the Lakota people came from town, gossip and newspaper stories, most of which painted them as savage enemies of civilization. But as she walked through their ancestral lands, seeing the careful way they had managed the landscape and lived in harmony with the natural world, she began to question those stories. The camp appeared gradually, like a mirage becoming real. First, she noticed the smoke from cooking fires drifting up into the clear blue sky. Then she saw the tips of the teepees through the trees. Finally, the full settlement came into view, a carefully organized community of families living along the banks of the creek. She was still 100 yards away when she realized they had been watching her approach. Warriors emerged from the camp, moving with quiet confidence toward her position. At their head walked a man who commanded immediate attention, tall and strong, with long dark hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything at once. This had to be Running Wolf, the leader she had heard mentioned in the frightened whispers of townspeople. But as he drew closer, Sarah saw something in his expression that the stories had never mentioned: wisdom, compassion, and a deep sadness that spoke of a man who had seen too much conflict and yearned for peace. "You are the white woman sent by the cattle baron," he said in carefully spoken English, his voice neither hostile nor welcoming. "I am Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell," she replied, surprised by her own courage. "And I was not sent, I was sold." Something flickered in Running Wolf's dark eyes at her words. He studied her face for a long moment, as if reading a story written there that others had missed. "Come," he said finally. "You will be safe here while we decide what is to be done." As they walked toward the camp together, Running Wolf spoke quietly to his warriors in their own language. Sarah caught none of the words, but she sensed a change in the atmosphere around her. The tension remained, but it was no longer directed at her personally. The Lakota camp was unlike anything she had ever seen. The teepees were arranged in a careful pattern that created both privacy for families and open spaces for the community. Together, children played games in the grass while their mothers worked on intricate beadwork or prepared meals over carefully tended fires. Elder men sat in the shade, sharing stories and wisdom with anyone who would listen. What struck Sarah most was the sense of belonging that permeated everything. Every person had a place, a purpose, a voice in the community. It was so different from the lonely isolation she had known in Copper Creek, where women were expected to be seen but not heard, valued only for their ability to serve men's needs. Running Wolf led her to a comfortable spot near the center of the camp and gestured for her to sit on a beautifully woven blanket. A woman approached with a bowl of water and a plate of food, simple fare, but offered with genuine kindness. "My sister, Morning Star," Running Wolf explained as the woman smiled at Sarah. "She speaks little English, but her heart is good." Over the following days, Sarah began to understand the true nature of the Lakota people. They were not the savage enemies described in town newspapers, but a complex, sophisticated society with their own laws, customs, and deep spiritual beliefs. They lived in careful balance with the natural world, taking only what they needed and giving back more than they took. Running Wolf became her guide and protector, teaching her about his people's ways while learning about her own background. He had studied at a mission school in his youth and spoke English fluently, but he had chosen to return to his people rather than try to live in the white world that would never fully accept him. "Why did Blackwood really send you here?" he asked. One evening, as they sat by the creek, watching the sun set over the prairie, Sarah told him the truth, all of it, how her father's gambling had destroyed their family, how Blackwood intended to use her as justification for an attack on the Lakota people, how she was supposed to be the spark that would ignite a war. Running Wolf listened without judgment, his expression growing more thoughtful with each detail she shared. "He expects us to harm you," Running Wolf said when she finished, "or at least, he hopes we will give him reason to claim that we have." "Yes," Sarah replied quietly, "then we will disappoint him greatly." Over the weeks that followed, Sarah discovered what it meant to be truly valued. The Lakota women welcomed her into their circle, teaching her their skills and treating her as an equal. Morning Star became like a sister to her, patiently helping her learn the language and customs of her new temporary home. But it was Running Wolf who truly captured her heart. He was unlike any man she had ever known, strong but gentle, wise but humble, a leader who served his people rather than commanding them. Their evening walks by the creek became the highlight of each day, conversations that ranged from practical matters to dreams of a better future. "What will you do when this is over?" Running Wolf asked one night as they sat beneath a canopy of stars. "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "I can't go back to my father. He has nothing left to offer me except more shame, and I won't go to Blackwood no matter what the law might say." "There is another choice," Running Wolf said quietly. Sarah looked at him, seeing something new in his expression, hope, affection, and perhaps something deeper. You could stay with us, with me. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge across an impossible canyon. Sarah felt her heart racing as she considered what he was offering, not just refuge, but a completely different kind of life. Your people would accept me, she asked. They already have, Running Wolf replied. Morning Star told me yesterday that you have learned more of our ways in 3 weeks than some of our own young people learn in 3 years. You have a place here if you want it. Before Sarah could answer, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Running Wolf rose immediately, his hand moving to the knife at his belt. In the distance, torches flickered as a group of riders approached the camp. Marshal Clayton, Running Wolf said, recognizing the lead rider. He comes under a white flag, but he does not come alone. Marshal James Clayton was a decent man caught in an impossible situation. Blackwood had been pressuring him for weeks to rescue the kidnapped white woman, threatening to go over his head to the territorial governor if he didn't act soon. As the marshal dismounted near the edge of camp, Sarah and Running Wolf walked forward to meet him. Clayton's weathered face showed the strain of recent weeks, and his eyes held an apology that he couldn't quite voice. Miss Mitchell, he said formally, I've come to verify your situation and ensure your safety. I am perfectly safe, Marshal, Sarah replied clearly. I am here by choice, and I am treated with nothing but kindness and respect. The law requires, Clayton began, but Running Wolf stepped forward. The law requires many things, Marshal, but what does justice require? Clayton looked between them, seeing something in their faces that Blackwood's reports had not prepared him for. This was not a frightened captive and her savage captor. This was 2 people who had found something precious together, something worth protecting. Miss Mitchell, the marshal said carefully, I need you to tell me, in front of these witnesses, exactly what your situation is. Sarah took Running Wolf's hand, feeling the strength and warmth that had become her anchor in an uncertain world. My father gambled away everything we owned, including me, she said clearly. Harrison Blackwood planned to use me to provoke a war with these people so he could steal their land. Instead, I found a community that values me for who I am, not what I can provide to men's ambitions. I found a man who protects me without trying to own me. I found a family, she paused, looking directly at Clayton. I choose to stay here, Marshal, not as a captive, but as a woman making her own decision about her own life. The marshal removed his hat and ran his hand through his graying hair. He had seen enough of the world to recognize love when he encountered it, and he had seen enough of Harrison Blackwood to know what kind of man he was dealing with. The territorial law says a woman of legal age can choose her own guardian, he said finally. If you're saying you choose to remain with the Lakota people of your own free will, I am saying I choose to remain with the man I love, Sarah replied, and with the people who have shown me what true family means. Clayton nodded slowly, then turned to address the small group of townspeople who had ridden with him. Let it be recorded that Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell remains with the Lakota people by her own choice, under the protection of Running Wolf. Any man who tries to change that situation without her consent will be acting outside the law. As the marshal prepared to leave, he approached Sarah one final time. Are you absolutely certain about this choice? He asked quietly. The path ahead won't be easy. There will always be those who won't understand or accept what you've chosen. Sarah smiled, feeling the warmth of Running Wolf's hand in hers and the acceptance of the community that had embraced her. I've learned something these past weeks, Marshal, she said. I've learned that home isn't a place you're born into, where you're valued for who you truly are, and sometimes the people the world calls your enemies are really just people you haven't taken the time to understand. As Clayton and his men rode back toward Copper Creek, Sarah and Running Wolf stood together under the endless prairie sky. Behind them, the camp continued its evening routines, children being called in for the night, fires being banked for sleep, families gathering close in the comfortable darkness. Are you ready for this new life? Running Wolf asked softly. Sarah looked back toward the town where she had been born but never truly belonged, then at the camp where she had found her real home. My choice is made, she whispered. My heart is yours, and my future is with your people. As they walked hand in hand back toward the warm glow of the campfires, Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, who would soon be known among the Lakota as Woman Who Chooses, her path, knew that she had finally found where she belonged, not because she had been sold or traded or commanded to be there, but because she had chosen love over fear, understanding over hatred, and freedom over the chains that others had tried to place around her heart. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and somewhere in the distance, a night bird called out its lonely song. But Sarah was no longer lonely. She had found her place in the world, and it was exactly where she had chosen to be.